Calvin Whitfield was 42 years old, and until that Tuesday night, he believed he was coming home to his wife. He was an offshore petroleum engineer, 6 months at a time on a Gulf of Mexico platform, doing the kind of work that paid for the custom-built house in Baton Rouge that he had purchased, deed in his name alone, long before Renee ever walked through its front door. He came home 2 days early. She didn't answer his call, didn't answer his text. So he used his key. Inside his own house sat furniture he didn't choose, wall art he didn't approve, and a stranger's size 12 sneakers parked beside the door like they belonged there. Then a man Calvin had never seen walked down Calvin's staircase, wearing Calvin's guest robe, and extended a hand like he had nothing to worry about. Renee told Calvin to sleep in the guest room. She said it at his own kitchen table. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that Calvin had already started counting. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The offshore platform hummed with its familiar mechanical rhythm, a sound Calvin had grown accustomed to over his 15 years working the Gulf. He stood at the railing, watching the late afternoon sun paint the water in shades of gray and silver. Around him, the evening crew moved with practiced efficiency, each person knowing their role in the complex dance of maintaining the massive structure. Calvin checked his phone again. Still no response from Renee. The last text he'd sent sat unanswered. Heading home early. Should be there Tuesday night. He tucked the phone back into his coveralls, feeling the worn edges of his real estate law reference book in the same pocket. The book had become something of a talisman over the years, a reminder that understanding the fine print mattered. The helicopter ride to shore was smooth. The pilot someone Calvin had flown with dozens of times before. They exchanged their usual brief nods. Out here, competence spoke louder than words. As they lifted off, Calvin watched the platform shrink against the horizon, his mind already shifting toward home. The drive from New Orleans started just as the sun was setting. Calvin settled into the rhythm of the highway, his truck eating up the miles as his thoughts wandered through the past 5 years. He remembered the day he'd met Renee at that backyard barbecue, her laugh carrying across the crowd, the way she'd made everyone feel like the most interesting person in the world. She'd done that for him, too, in the beginning. The marriage had been good, those first 3 years. They'd built something together. Or so he'd thought. The event planning business had been her dream, and he'd been proud to help make it real. $40,000 from his savings, carefully accumulated through long rotations offshore. He'd trusted her with it completely. But something had shifted, subtle at first. Phone calls grew shorter, video chats more perfunctory. When he tried to discuss the business finances, Renee would wave him off with increasing irritation. "You don't need to micromanage everything," she'd say. "The business is doing fine." Calvin passed through Baton Rouge's outskirts, muscle memory guiding him through familiar turns. He was good at solving problems. It was literally his job, keeping complex systems running smoothly in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. But this felt different. The signs were there, but he couldn't quite read them, couldn't quite bring himself to name what they might mean. He thought about the house as he drove, every decision that had gone into building it, every contractor he'd vetted, every payment he'd made, the custom cabinets in the kitchen, the extra-large garage that could fit both their vehicles, plus his workshop, the covered back patio where they'd planned to host family gatherings. He'd built it all 2 years before meeting Renee, but he'd always thought of it as their future together. The subdivision was quiet as he turned onto his street. Most windows were dark, his neighbors already settled in for the night. Calvin slowed as he approached his driveway, headlights sweeping across an unfamiliar black truck parked in his usual spot. It was a newer model, well-maintained, with a gym bag visible through the back window. He pulled up behind it, letting his engine idle for a moment. The house lights were on inside, warm and welcoming through the windows. But something felt wrong. The truck shouldn't be there. The silence from Renee shouldn't have stretched this long. Calvin killed his engine and sat in the darkness of his cab. The truck's presence felt like a question he didn't want to answer. Through the front window, he could see movement inside his house, shadows passing through rooms he'd built with his own money, his own careful planning. He checked his phone one last time. Still no response from Renee. The time showed 9:47 p.m. His hand rested on the door handle, not yet pulling it. The night air was humid, typical for Louisiana this time of year. The kind of weather that made everything feel heavier, more significant. Calvin watched his house, and waited, letting the moment stretch out like the platform's shadow across the Gulf water at sunset. Then, with the same deliberate movement he used for every important task in his life, he opened his truck door and stepped out into the night. Calvin's key slid into the lock, the same lock he'd installed himself 3 years ago. The door opened silently on well-maintained hinges. He stepped inside, and immediately his senses registered that something was wrong. The familiar layout of his home had been altered, transformed into something he barely recognized. Where his leather recliner had stood, an angular modern sectional now dominated the space. The walls, once adorned with photographs he'd carefully selected, now displayed abstract art pieces he'd never seen before. His eyes tracked the changes methodically, cataloging each violation of his space like entries in a ledger. The garage workshop items, his tools, his projects, the careful organization of 15 years of collected equipment, had been relocated. Through the garage door window, he could see boxes stacked haphazardly, his workbench pushed against the far wall as if his craftsmanship was an afterthought to be stored away. A black gym bag lay open on his hardwood floor, expensive athletic wear spilling out onto the boards he'd personally selected for their durability. Next to the front door, a pair of size 12 Nike training shoes sat casually aligned, positioned with the comfortable certainty of ownership. Calvin wore a size 10. These shoes didn't belong here, just like their owner didn't belong here. The kitchen light spilled into the hallway, and Renee emerged, wrapped in a silk robe Calvin had never seen before. Her face performed a rapid sequence of expressions. First shock at his unexpected presence, then quick calculation as she assessed the situation, finally settling into a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Calvin!" Her voice carried forced brightness. "You weren't supposed to be back until Thursday. Why didn't you call?" "I did." His voice was quiet, steady. "You didn't answer." Before Renee could respond, footsteps sounded on the stairs. The stairs Calvin had reinforced himself when they'd creaked that first year. A man descended, tall and fit, wearing Calvin's guest robe, the thick terry cloth one Renee had given him 2 Christmases ago. The man reached the bottom of the stairs and smiled easily, as if this was the most natural situation in the world. "Hey, man, you must be Calvin. I'm Terrell." He extended his hand, his posture relaxed, almost dismissive. His entire manner suggested he expected Calvin to accept this intrusion without question. Calvin looked at the offered hand for a moment, then took it. His grip was neither weak nor challenging, just present, like everything else about him. The handshake lasted exactly as long as proper etiquette required. No longer. Renee jumped in, words tumbling out faster than her usual measured pace. "Calvin, let me explain. Terrell is a friend who's been having some issues with his apartment. It's just temporary, really. It's not what you might be thinking." "How long?" Calvin's question cut through her explanation like a blade through water. Terrell, interpreting Calvin's stillness as resignation, answered with casual confidence. "About 6 weeks now, man. Look, I know this is a little awkward." Calvin's gaze shifted to the kitchen. Without a word, he walked past both of them and made himself a cup of coffee. His movements were precise, familiar, measuring the grounds, adding the water, waiting for it to brew. He could feel them watching him, waiting for an explosion that wasn't coming. When the coffee was ready, he sat at his kitchen table, the solid oak piece he'd driven 3 hours to pick up from a craftsman in Lafayette. Terrell and Renee remained standing, their certainty beginning to show tiny cracks. Renee moved closer, her silk robe catching the kitchen light. "Calvin, we need to talk. The marriage. It hasn't been working for a while now. I've developed feelings for Terrell, and I think we need to be honest about where we are." She paused, then added with practiced gentleness, "I think it would be best if you slept in the guest room tonight, just while we figure things out." She said this in Calvin's house, at Calvin's table, with another man wearing Calvin's robe. The silence stretched out, broken only by the soft tick of the kitchen clock, another item Calvin had carefully selected years ago. He lifted his coffee cup, took a measured sip, and set it down precisely on the coaster. "All right," he said, his voice carrying neither anger nor defeat. He stood, picked up his bag from where he'd set it by the kitchen door, and walked toward the guest room. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Calvin woke at 4:45 a.m., his internal clock still set to offshore platform time. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the central air system he'd installed 2 summers ago. He lay still for a moment in the guest bed, mind clear, then rose without making a sound. His feet carried him soundlessly across the hardwood floors. He knew every board that might creak, having laid them himself. The home office door was at the end of the hall, its brass handle catching the faint light from the street lamp outside. The key was where it had always been, in his wallet. Renee had asked for a copy once, claiming she needed access to the files. He'd suggested they could review anything she needed together. She never asked again. The office smelled of leather and paper, his father's old desk chair, the filing cabinets he'd bought at auction, the neat rows of documents that tracked every major decision of his adult life. Calvin clicked on the small desk lamp, its light carefully angled away from the door's edge. The filing cabinet opened with a whisper of well-oiled metal. His fingers found each document by memory. The deed to the house, filed in a red folder. Mortgage documents showing the refinance he'd done 2 years before meeting Renee. Business incorporation papers for Whitfield and Fontaine events. Records from their joint accounts. He laid them on the desk in precise rows, like pieces on a chessboard. Using his phone, Calvin photographed each document methodically. The flash was off, but he still angled each page to catch the desk lamp's light perfectly. Every detail had to be clear. He could hear his offshore supervisor's voice. "Document everything. The paperwork is your shield." By 6:15 a.m., he was sliding into a booth at the Sunrise Diner off Highland Road. The vinyl seats were cracked, but clean. The coffee strong enough to strip paint. Calvin ordered eggs, bacon, and grits from a waitress whose name tag read Miss Betty. From his truck's center console, he retrieved a small notebook, the same kind he used for equipment logs offshore. The first call to Patricia Odom went to voicemail, which didn't surprise him. He left a message that was precise and unhurried. "Patricia, this is Calvin Whitfield. I need to verify some property ownership details. It's important. Please call when you can." The notebook lay open before him, blank page waiting. Calvin wrote the date at the top, then began his list in the same careful print he used for technical documentation. Miss Betty brought his breakfast, took one look at his face, and wordlessly topped off his coffee. At 9:47 a.m., Patricia Odom called back. Calvin stepped outside the diner to take it, standing in the morning sun beside his truck. "The house is solely in your name," Patricia confirmed, her voice carrying the dry certainty of decades in real estate law. "You purchased it 2 years before the marriage, refinanced once since then. There was never an amendment to add another owner. And my rights regarding occupancy? As sole owner, you have the right to determine who lives there. Anyone without legal claim or permission is considered—" Patricia paused, then said with careful precision, A trespasser. Calvin wrote the word in his notebook. Thank you, Patricia. I'll need to schedule a meeting soon. When he returned home, Renee's car was gone. Terrell's truck was absent too. Calvin went straight to the master bedroom with the spare lock he kept in his workshop supplies. The same brand as the original, because he believed in consistency. The installation took less than 15 minutes. He moved his clothes and essential items back into the master bedroom, hanging each shirt with the same care he'd used when he first bought them. When he finished, he sat on the edge of the bed, his bed, and waited. Renee returned at 6:45 p.m. Calvin heard her car pull in, heard her key in the front door. He called down from the top of the stairs. We need to talk. Without Terrell. In the kitchen, Calvin placed 2 items on the table. The deed to the house and Patricia Odom's business card. Renee stared at them, her composure slipping for the first time since his return. This is my house, Calvin said quietly. Solely and legally. Terrell has 2 weeks to find other arrangements. You have until Friday to decide if you're staying as my wife or leaving with him. Those are the only options. Renee's laugh held no humor. You think you can control everything with paperwork? I learned not to rely on anything else. Calvin's voice remained level. Friday, Renee. She pushed back from the table and went upstairs, her footsteps sharp against the stairs. Calvin remained in the living room after the lights were out, sitting in his father's old armchair. Terrell's gym bag lay on the floor like a black hole in the darkness. Calvin opened his notebook, using the faint light from the street to see the page. At the bottom of his list, he wrote a single word: beginning. The morning sun painted sharp rectangles on Calvin's kitchen table as he opened his laptop. Renee's footsteps echoed from upstairs, a rhythmic pacing he chose to ignore. Terrell's truck was gone from the driveway. Temporary retreat or permanent exit. Calvin didn't particularly care which. He typed in the password for the business banking portal of Whitfield and Fontaine Events. The screen filled with numbers, each one a piece of the story he'd funded with $40,000 of careful savings. Calvin had always been deliberate with money. Growing up poor in Baton Rouge taught lessons that stuck. He clicked through to the transaction history, starting 18 months back. His eyes moved methodically down the screen, the same way he checked pressure gauges offshore, looking for patterns, looking for leaks. The first irregularity jumped out immediately: a consulting fee payment to Okafor LLC for $2,800. Calvin opened a new spreadsheet and logged the date, amount, and payee. Then he found another, and another. The pattern emerged with ugly clarity. Regular payments, varying amounts, totaling $34,000 over 18 months. He ran a business registry search. Okafor LLC had been formed 8 months ago, a single-member company with Terrell listed as owner. Systematic, Calvin murmured, the word bitter in his mouth. He kept scrolling. The business credit card statements told their own story. Hotel charges at the Renaissance in Miami, $890 for a 3-night stay. First-class flight upgrades. Restaurant bills from places Calvin had never been invited to. All officially logged as business development expenses, all approved by Renee as managing partner. Calvin's coffee grew cold beside him as he dug deeper. 2 major vendor contracts caught his attention, both canceled within the past year, replaced with new suppliers he'd never heard of. The new contracts carried markups that made no sense for the services described. He saved screenshots of everything, creating a detailed folder with timestamp documentation. The expansion account, meant to fund their growth into larger venues, showed a steady drip of withdrawals disguised as operational expenses. What had started as a healthy 6-figure balance had been hollowed out like a rotting tree, leaving just enough to maintain the appearance of stability. Calvin's phone felt heavy in his hand as he dialed Patricia Odom's number. She answered on the second ring. "I'm looking at some concerning business records," he said quietly, aware of Renee's continued presence upstairs. "Our LLC, There are payments to a company owned by the house guest I mentioned. Patricia's silence spoke volumes. When she finally responded, her voice carried the weight of 30 years in business law. How much are we talking about? 34,000 in direct payments, more in questionable expenses. Vendor contracts rewritten with suspicious markups. That's misappropriation, Patricia said flatly. You'll need documentation. I can recommend a forensic accountant. I know someone, Calvin interrupted. Gerald Webb. He handles financials for my offshore crew. Does forensic work on the side. Get him started immediately, Patricia advised. Everything needs to be documented properly for what comes next. Calvin heard Renee's footsteps approaching the stairs. I'll be in touch, he said, ending the call. He could feel her watching him from the doorway as he continued working. She didn't speak. Neither did he. The silence stretched between them like a tripwire. When she finally left, Calvin heard her car start up outside. The sound faded into the morning traffic. He closed the laptop with a soft click that felt, somehow, final. The notebook was still in his pocket, its pages holding the beginning of his response. He opened it to a fresh page, drew a clean line under yesterday's notes. With the same precise handwriting he used for platform safety logs, he wrote 3 names: Patricia Odom, Philip Achebe, Duane. His finger hovered over Gerald Webb's contact in his phone. Each number he pressed felt like arming a detonator. The line connected. Gerald, it's Calvin Whitfield. I need your professional services. The other kind of accounting. The Friday morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows as Calvin measured coffee grounds into the filter. He heard Renee's footsteps on the stairs, different from her usual morning rhythm, deliberate, paced, like an actor finding their mark. When he turned, she stood in the doorway wearing a cream-colored blouse he recognized from their anniversary dinner last year. Terrell's truck was conspicuously absent from the driveway. The size 12 shoes no longer cluttered the entryway. The gym bag had vanished as if it had never existed. I've been thinking, Renee said, her voice carefully modulated. She'd applied makeup with precision, enough to look polished, but not enough to seem artificial. About everything. About us. Calvin poured water into the coffee maker. The machine gurgled to life. He waited. I made a mistake, she continued, moving to sit at the kitchen table. Her hands clasped together, a gesture he'd seen her use with difficult clients. A terrible mistake. I let things get confused, and I hurt you, and I want to make it right. He noticed she positioned herself where the morning light would catch the tears when they came. The observation settled in his mind without rancor. He'd spent 15 years reading pressure gauges. Watching for warning signs was reflex now. I love you, Renee said, her voice catching perfectly. Right on cue, the first tear traced down her cheek. I know that might be hard to believe right now, but I do. I think we should try couples counseling. I found someone who specializes in rebuilding trust after infidelity. Calvin poured 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of her, remembering how she took it. Splash of cream, no sugar. A detail that mattered once. I've already told Terrell it's over, she added, wrapping her hands around the mug. Completely over. He's gone back to his apartment. I want to focus on us, on rebuilding. She spoke about healing and second chances, about how sometimes people lose their way but find their way back. Her words were perfect, clearly rehearsed, but perfect. What struck Calvin most was what she didn't say. No questions about his feelings, no acknowledgement of the specific wounds she'd inflicted, no mention of the business or the house or the years he'd spent building both. I'm willing to try, he said finally, his voice level. The relief that flooded her face was genuine. The first real emotion he'd seen since she came downstairs. Really? She reached for his hand across the table. Her fingers were cool against his palm. Would you like some breakfast? He asked, standing. I could make those eggs you like. That would be wonderful, she smiled, settling back in her chair. Victory glowed beneath her carefully maintained composure. Calvin moved around the kitchen with unhurried precision. He didn't mention Gerald Webb combing through the business records. He didn't mention Philip Achebe's assessment of the commercial lease's market value. He didn't mention Patricia Odom's quiet satisfaction when he'd called to update her yesterday. Instead, he asked about her week. He listened as she talked about a potential new client, about her mother's church group, about plans for updating the guest bathroom. Her voice grew more natural with each minute, confidence replacing calculation. The eggs came out perfectly, slightly runny yolks, just how she preferred. She ate with visible pleasure, relaxing into what she clearly saw as a return to normal. "I was thinking," she said, finishing the last bite, "maybe we could have dinner with Mom and Dad soon. Show them we're working things out." "That sounds good," Calvin replied, collecting their plates. He watched her check her phone, already shifting mental gears toward her workday, toward the business she thought was still securely hers. After she left for the office, Calvin washed the dishes with methodical care. He dried each one completely before returning it to its proper place. The kitchen gleamed in the late morning light. His phone felt heavy in his pocket. He dried his hands on a dish towel and pulled out his notebook first. Under yesterday's entry, he wrote in his precise handwriting, "She still thinks she controls the room." Then he texted Gerald Webb, "How soon can you have a preliminary report?" The reply came within the hour. "Give me 10 days. 10 days later, Calvin's kitchen was filled with the gentle hum of his coffee maker as Gerald Webb spread documents across the table. The forensic accountant, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who spoke with the precise clarity Calvin recognized from offshore operations, had arrived exactly on time with an accordion folder and a tablet. "I've organized everything by category," Gerald said, laying out the 11-page report with tabs marking different sections. "The executive summary covers the major findings, but you'll want to review the complete documentation." Calvin picked up the summary page. The paper was still warm from Gerald's printer. His eyes moved methodically down the bullet points, the same way he read pressure gauge readings, looking for the numbers that didn't belong. He found them in the third paragraph: account number, routing number, opening balance, current balance, $61,000. "This account," Calvin said, tapping the page with one finger. "Walk me through it." Gerald pulled up a flow chart on his tablet. It was opened 14 months ago at Gulf Credit Union. Sole account holder, Renee Whitfield. The initial deposit came from the business account, but it wasn't a direct transfer. The money moved through 2 intermediate accounts first. One registered to the business's cleaning service, one to a vendor I can't verify actually exists. Calvin remembered 14 months ago. He'd been on the Atlantis platform for his longest rotation, 96 days straight, because they were short-staffed, and he had the expertise they needed. He'd called Renee every night he could get a signal. She'd told him she was holding everything together. "The pattern continues," Gerald went on, scrolling through transaction records. "Small amounts, usually under $5,000, moving through different vendors before landing in this account. Always when you were offshore. The transfers stop completely during your home rotations." Calvin opened the full report. He read every page. His coffee went cold beside him. The numbers told a story in stark black and white. While he was reading pressure gauges 300 miles out in the Gulf, Renee had been building an escape fund with the same methodical patience he applied to maintaining critical systems. The business he'd capitalized had been her vessel. His absences had been her cover. He reached for his phone and called Patricia Odom. "I'm looking at a savings account," he said when she answered. "Opened 14 months ago. Funded through the business. Currently holds $61,000. What does that tell you?" Patricia's voice was dry as sand. "It tells me someone was planning their exit long before they made their move. Classic preparation pattern. Establish independent finances while maintaining appearance of commitment. The routing through multiple accounts suggests awareness of scrutiny. Would you like me to add this to the civil complaint? Yes, Calvin said. I'll have Gerald send you the full report. After he hung up, Gerald gathered his documents efficiently. I can have a more detailed analysis by Friday if you need it. This is enough, Calvin said. He walked Gerald to the door. Alone in his kitchen, Calvin stood at the window that overlooked the backyard. The grass needed cutting. He'd always handled that during his home rotations, one of the 100 small ways he'd maintained the life they were building, or the life he thought they were building. For one moment, brief as a pressure gauge spike, sharp as a midnight alarm, he felt the full weight of the years he'd spent believing, not in the marriage itself. That pain was still too new to measure. No, this was deeper. This was the slow comprehension that while he was applying his discipline to building something real, Renee had been applying hers to building an illusion. The moment passed. He folded it away like a completed checklist. He picked up his phone again and called his brother. "Sunday dinner," he said when Dwayne answered. "My house." "What time?" 6. "Bring Patricia and Philip." "That bad?" "That clear," Calvin corrected. He hung up and opened his notebook. The sun was setting when Renee's car pulled into the driveway. He heard her heels on the walkway, the key in the door, the rustle of her putting away her coat. "How was your day?" she asked, finding him in the kitchen. Her smile was practiced, perfect, productive, Calvin said. He meant it. Sunday afternoon light slanted through Calvin's kitchen windows as he checked the roast in the oven. The house filled with the warm scent of slow-cooked meat, garlic, and herbs. His mother's recipe, the one she'd taught him during those years when dinner depended on making cheaper cuts tender. Dwayne arrived first, exactly as Calvin knew he would. His brother carried himself like he always did when something serious was happening, shoulders set, jaw tight, the look of a man ready to lift whatever needed lifting. "You cooking Mama's roast?" Dwayne asked, hanging his jacket by the door. "Seemed right," Calvin said. Philip Achebe arrived next, dress shirt crisp even on a Sunday, carrying a leather portfolio that Calvin recognized from real estate closing. They'd been roommates long enough in college to read each other's silences. Philip took one look at Calvin's face and nodded once, understanding this wasn't a social gathering. Patricia Odom's sedan pulled up last. She'd changed from her usual court suits into casual clothes, but her eyes were just as sharp as they were in her office. "I'm here as a friend," she said when Calvin opened the door. "But I brought the relevant sections of the LLC statute just in case anyone has questions." Calvin served the food without ceremony. Roast, potatoes, green beans with bacon the way his mother made them. They ate first, the conversation light and careful, everyone understanding that the real meal hadn't started yet. When the plates were cleared, Calvin opened the folder he'd kept beside his chair. He laid out the documents one by one on the kitchen table, his movements as precise as when he checked gauge readings offshore. 18 months of business records, he said, pointing to the first stack. $34,000 in consulting fees paid to Terrell Okafor's Shell, LLC. Registered 8 months ago. He set down Gerald Webb's report next. Forensic accounting shows a hidden savings account. $61,000. Opened 14 months ago while I was on extended rotation. Dwayne's hand tightened on his water glass. "I'll handle Terrell," he said, voice low and final. "No," Calvin said. "Terrell isn't the point. He's not even in the equation." Philip opened his portfolio and pulled out several sheets of commercial property data. "The storefront lease for Whitfield and Fontaine events," he said, sliding them across the table. "It's solely in your name, Calvin. Property values in that area have increased 40% since initial signing. Without your signature on renewal, there is no business location." Patricia picked up the lease documents, scanning them with practiced efficiency. "The LLC dissolution is straightforward given the documented misappropriation. My colleague Marcus handles these cases. He can file first thing Tuesday." The civil claim for recovery of funds runs parallel. She looked at Calvin. The hidden account gives us clear evidence of intent. Calvin nodded, then turned to each person in turn. Philip, I need you to quietly let your commercial real estate contacts know the lease won't be renewed. Patricia, have Marcus ready with the dissolution paperwork. I'll sign Tuesday morning. Dwayne. He paused. I need you to not do anything to Terrell. This isn't about him. What about the house? Dwayne asked, still tense but accepting the instruction. That comes last, Calvin said, after everything else is in motion. They talked through the details for another hour. Timing, sequence, documentation. Calvin took notes in his small notebook, each person's role clearly defined. When everything was settled, he thanked them individually and walked them to the door before Renee was due back from her sister's house. Alone in his kitchen, Calvin picked up his phone. He typed a single message to Renee. I'd like to have dinner with your parents Sunday. I think it's time we talked as a family. Her response lit up his screen less than a minute later. Of course. I'll set it up. Calvin set the phone face down on the table. He opened his notebook to a fresh page, uncapped his pen, and began writing. Each step in sequence, each action in its proper order, like planning a complex maintenance operation offshore, where one wrong move could cascade into system failure. The pen moved steadily across the paper. He did not rush a single word. The Fontaine home stood quiet and dignified in the Sunday afternoon light, its brick facade warmed by the late autumn sun. Calvin parked his truck at the curb, straightened his tie, and lifted the manila folder from the passenger seat. Inside, through the living room window, he could see Gloria Fontaine arranging flowers in a vase, the same after-church ritual she'd performed every Sunday for the 5 years he'd been part of this family. He walked up the concrete path, his dress shoes clicking against the familiar steps he'd climbed so many times before. Before he could knock, Gloria opened the door, her face lighting up with genuine warmth. "Calvin," she said, pulling him into a gentle hug. She smelled of church perfume and the coconut hand lotion she always used. "It's so good to see you." Raymond appeared behind her, extending his weathered hand. His handshake was firm and honest, the grip of a man who had spent 30 years sorting mail and believed a handshake meant something. "Son," he said quietly, and Calvin felt the weight of that word. Renee was already at the dining room table, wearing a cream-colored dress he'd never seen before. She looked relaxed, confident. She had framed this dinner to her parents as a step toward reconciliation, and her smile suggested she believed her own story. The table was set with Gloria's good china, the set she only used for holiday meals and special occasions. A pot roast steamed in the center, surrounded by glazed carrots and Gloria's famous potato casserole. Calvin remembered dozens of Sunday dinners at this table, the easy conversation, the feeling of belonging. "Let me take that folder," Gloria offered, reaching for it. "I'll hold on to it for now," Calvin said gently. "Thank you." They settled into their usual seats, Gloria and Raymond at the ends, Calvin and Renee across from each other. Grace was said. Food was passed. For 20 minutes they ate and talked about safe things. The weather, Raymond's garden, the church's fall festival plans. Calvin waited until Gloria had finished her first helping, until the initial rush of serving and passing had settled into the quiet rhythm of a family meal. He set his fork down carefully beside his plate. "Gloria," he said, his voice soft but carrying. "Raymond, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it from me directly." Gloria's hand paused with her water glass halfway to her lips. Raymond set down his fork. "I love your daughter," Calvin continued, maintaining eye contact with both of them. "I have spent 5 years building something I believed in completely. Recently, I learned that while I was working offshore, pieces of what we built were being taken apart in ways I need you to understand." He opened the folder with steady hands. The first document he laid on the table was the LLC registration for Whitfield and Fontaine events. This is the business I funded with $40,000 of my savings. He placed Gerald Webb's forensic report next to it. This shows $34,000 paid to a shell company registered to Terrell Okafor 8 months ago. Renee's fingers tightened around her napkin, but Calvin kept his focus on her parents. This, he said, placing another document down, is a savings account opened 14 months ago, containing $61,000 moved from the business through concealed transfers. The account is in Renee's name only. Gloria's face had gone very still. Raymond's eyes moved from the papers to his stepdaughter. "Terrell has been living in my house," Calvin said, his voice remaining level. "Not as a temporary guest with apartment troubles, as Renee told you, but as her boyfriend of several months. He was wearing my robe when I came home early." Renee stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is a betrayal of my privacy," she said, her voice sharp with accusation. Calvin looked at her for the first time since he'd begun speaking. "Which privacy, Renee? The private business account you emptied? The private boyfriend you moved into my house? The private plan you built with my work while I was offshore? Renee." Gloria's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of every Sunday dinner, every church service, every value she'd tried to instill. Raymond just looked at his stepdaughter, his expression a mixture of disappointment and something deeper, the look of a man who had spent years trying to be a father to someone who had never fully let him in. Calvin closed the folder with the same careful precision he'd used to open it. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed 2 items, a business card and a legal notice. He placed them beside his plate. "The LLC dissolution filing begins tomorrow morning," he said. "The commercial lease will not be renewed when it expires in 4 months. The house will be listed within 30 days. This is my attorney's card, and this is the formal notice of dissolution. Everything else will come through official channels." He stood, straightening his tie. "Gloria, thank you for dinner. Your cooking has always been a blessing." He turned to Raymond, extending his hand. "Sir, it has been a genuine honor to be part of your family." Raymond's handshake was firm as ever, held a moment longer than usual. No words were needed. Calvin walked to his car alone, his steps measured and unhurried. He did not look back at the house. The drive home passed in complete silence. No radio, no phone calls, just the sound of tires on pavement. When he arrived, he went straight to his home office, opened the filing cabinet, and placed the folder inside. Calvin sat at his kitchen table early Monday morning, laptop open, coffee cooling beside him. His email chimed, a message from Patricia Odom's office with PDF attachment. The LLC dissolution paperwork and civil misappropriation complaint had been filed, complete with Gerald Webb's forensic report. He read the confirmation once, carefully, then closed the laptop. The morning air was crisp as he walked through his neighborhood. Fallen leaves crunched under his feet, and the sound reminded him of paper, documents, receipts, the steady accumulation of evidence. He walked for an hour, letting the rhythm of his steps match the precision of his thoughts. By Wednesday, Renee's attorney, a young man named Marcus Dupree, who seemed more accustomed to real estate closings than civil complaints, reached out to Patricia's colleague handling the case. His tone was conciliatory, suggesting they could work something out regarding the business division. "Mr. Whitfield's position is not negotiable on the core issues," Patricia's colleague explained, her voice carrying the weight of decades of similar conversations. "The misappropriated funds must be returned in full. The hidden account is subject to the civil claim. The commercial lease will not transfer under any proposed arrangement." Marcus tried another angle. "Ms. Whitfield has built substantial goodwill in the community." "Using Mr. Whitfield's capital," the attorney interrupted, "while routing funds to an undisclosed shell company. The forensic report is quite detailed." The negotiation attempts continued through the week, each one meeting the same immovable wall of documented fact. Calvin received updates, but did not engage directly. He was already focused on what came next. On Friday morning, Philip Achebe called. His voice carried the particular tone of someone delivering information they know will matter. "I had an interesting conversation with James Thibodeau at the Rivermark development," Philip said. "He was asking about commercial lease rates because Terrell Okafor told him he'd be looking for new space soon. Apparently, Terrell's been telling people the situation with you is nearly resolved, and that he and Renee will be moving into the house once you take the hint." Calvin absorbed this in silence. "He's been quite specific about it," Philip continued, "talking about where he'll put his home gym, which room will be his office. James said he seemed very certain." "Thank you," Calvin said quietly. He ended the call and opened his laptop. The formal notice to vacate, already prepared and saved in his documents folder, required only the date to be updated. He moved it 1 week earlier than the previously agreed schedule, well within his legal rights as sole owner, fully documented through Patricia's office. He sent it to Patricia for review, received her confirmation within an hour, and had it delivered to Renee by certified mail that afternoon. The following week, the event planning business began its quiet collapse. Without the lease and without operating funds, the carefully constructed facade cracked. 2 major corporate clients, unable to confirm the business's continued operation at its listed address, withdrew their contracts. Vendors, sensing instability, began requiring upfront payments that the depleted accounts couldn't cover. The social media presence Renee had built, all those perfectly staged photos, the glowing client testimonials, the carefully curated image of success, couldn't sustain the reality behind it. Clients began calling Calvin's attorney, asking about the business's status. The answers were legally precise and devastating in their clarity. Terrell, who had planned his future around inheriting both a house and a woman with a thriving business, found himself with neither. His confident predictions to James Thibodeau aged poorly in Baton Rouge's close-knit business community. On Thursday morning, Philip brought the listing agreement to Calvin's house. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Calvin had first opened Gerald Webb's report, and reviewed the documents together. Philip had done his research thoroughly. Comparable sales, market trends, suggested improvements for maximum return. Calvin signed in his precise handwriting. Philip stood, extending his hand across the table. "I'll have the photographer here tomorrow," Philip said. "We'll list on Monday." Calvin walked him to the door, shook his hand again, and watched his car disappear down the street. Then he turned back to the house, his house, for a little while longer, and began walking through each room slowly. The living room where he'd first seen Terrell in his robe, the kitchen where Renee had performed remorse, the home office where the evidence had waited in his filing cabinet. He touched door frames, noted paint that could use touching up, remembered what each room had meant to him before everything changed. It was time to pack. Morning sunlight streamed through Calvin's kitchen window, warming the granite countertop he'd selected himself. Every surface in his new house reflected careful choice, from the solid oak cabinets to the industrial-grade stainless steel appliances. Nothing here existed as compromise or accident. He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug, letting the warmth seep into his palms as his attorney's number lit up his phone. "Good morning, Calvin," Patricia Odom said. Her voice carried the satisfaction of completion. "I have the final update on the civil judgment. Renee has agreed to the structured repayment plan. The funds will come directly from the hidden account, managed through our office. Everything is drafted and ready for your signature." "I appreciate your work on this, Patricia," Calvin said quietly. "The courier will deliver the documents within the hour. Once you sign, this chapter is officially closed." Calvin ended the call and sat in the morning quiet. 14 months had redrawn every line of his life. The house around him, smaller than his previous home but smarter in its design, embodied the change. Each fixture, each paint color, Each piece of furniture represented a decision he'd made alone, guided by nothing but his own judgment. The doorbell chimed precisely 40 minutes later. Calvin signed the documents at his kitchen table, his handwriting as measured and clear as it had been on every legal paper that dismantled his previous life. He placed the papers in a manila folder, walked to his home office, and filed them away in the cabinet that now held the complete record of consequence and resolution. Standing there, he allowed himself a moment to consider where everyone had landed. Renee was renting a 2-bedroom apartment in a quieter part of town. Not the prestigious address she'd once imagined, but solid ground from which to rebuild. She'd started a smaller event planning operation, working mostly with local church functions and community organizations. The business was modest, but honest, built on her genuine talent rather than other people's resources. Calvin neither celebrated nor mourned this development. It simply was the natural geometry of choices meeting their outcomes. Terrell had moved to Metairie, taken a position at a mid-range gym, and developed a careful way of describing the situation as a misunderstanding when it came up in conversation. His certainty about inheriting Calvin's house had aged into something approaching humility, though Calvin heard through Philip that he still occasionally tried to leverage the story for sympathy in social settings. The house, the one Calvin had built his first future in, had sold for $41,000 over asking price in a competitive market. Philip Achebe had handled everything with characteristic precision, screening buyers, managing offers, ensuring clean closure. Calvin had used those proceeds as the down payment on his current property, a decision that felt like planting new roots in soil he'd tested himself. His professional life had shifted too. The promotion to senior systems manager had come with a more favorable rotation schedule. 3 weeks offshore, 3 weeks home. The rhythm suited him, balancing the work he genuinely loved with time to build his new life deliberately. And there was Lorraine Duckett. He'd met her through Dwayne's wife at a neighborhood barbecue 4 months ago. A biology teacher with direct eyes and an unhurried way of speaking that matched his own natural pace. She asked questions about his work because she was genuinely interested in systems, not because she was mining for narrative. She had 3 succulents on her classroom windowsill, graded papers at local coffee shops, and had never once asked him to explain his past. When he mentioned his offshore rotation schedule on their second date, she'd nodded and said, "That's a good rhythm for someone who takes their work seriously." It wasn't approval or criticism, just observation, clean and clear. Calvin finished his coffee, feeling the morning sun warm on his shoulders through the kitchen window. He opened the drawer where he kept his notebooks. He still preferred paper for important things, and selected a new one, its pages clean and waiting. The cover was black leather, professional grade, the kind of journal meant to last. He opened to the first page. The paper was smooth under his hand as he uncapped his pen. His writing was steady and sure as he placed one word at the top of the page. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.